February 1977 found me standing in the New Mexico desert where the land lay open and raw beneath a winter sky that felt too close and too empty. The sand stretched in shades of rust and bone, and the wind carried a cold that settled into the joints like a warning. I had spent more than 2 decades in uniform, and I believed I understood preparation and threat and silence, but nothing in my service had trained me for the feeling that rose in my chest as I faced the steel elevator doors of a place that officially did not exist. The sign said Research Station 7. The words were dull and harmless and designed to calm anyone who read them. I knew better before I ever stepped inside. My palm pressed against the biometric plate, and the metal read me as if I were a machine instead of a man. The doors parted with a hiss that sounded like a breath drawn by something deep underground. A security sergeant stood beside the panel with a face trained into neutrality. He asked where I was headed, and I told him level 9. His hand paused just long enough to tell me everything he did not say. He claimed routine and pressed the control. The descent began with a jolt that rattled the bones. Numbers slid past without sound. At level 7, the car slowed and warning lights painted the walls in red. A laser traced my eyes, and then my voice, and then something else that made my skin crawl because I could not name it. When the doors opened again, the air felt wrong. It was colder and too clean, and carried a sharp scent like hospitals mixed with metal. The corridor before me was not on any blueprint I had ever seen. Major Marcus Langley waited there with his uniform pressed and perfect, and his eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who had not slept since something went wrong. His handshake was firm and wet with sweat. He told me welcome to 9, and I told him to show me the problem. As we walked, the lights buzzed and our steps echoed like we were already inside a coffin. He spoke of power surges and missing personnel and a contamination breach in Sector D. When he said 6 missing, I stopped because his report had said 3. He admitted the report was outdated by the time it reached me. Armed guards stood before a massive blast door, and when I asked what lay beyond it, he said research labs and holding cells. When I asked holding cells for what, he hesitated and typed a long code. The door opened with a groan that seemed reluctant. He told me I had to see it myself. Inside, the laboratory machines hummed and screens flickered, and scientists moved with the brittle focus of people trying not to think. Observation windows lined the walls with thick glass looking down into chambers bathed in harsh white light. When I asked what I was seeing, Langley said research subjects. I approached the glass slowly because experience had taught me to respect distance. In the chamber stood a figure shaped like a man but stripped of humanity. The skin was gray and smooth, and the head was too large and the eyes too dark, as if depth itself lived inside them. I asked how long they had been here, and Langley said he did not know because the program predated him. He told me Captain Sinclair held the full history and that Sinclair was on level 10. I did not know there was a level 10. Langley said there was more than I thought. Before I could speak, the alarms screamed and red light flooded the lab. Voices shouted breach in Sector D, and I grabbed Langley and asked where we were. Sector C, he said. Adjacent. A young voice crackled over the intercom asking for help in the lower tunnels. I demanded the command center and ignored protocol when a scientist tried to stop me. Beyond a reinforced door, a stairwell dropped into darkness, and heat bled away with every step until my breath fogged. Langley told me Sector D held the non-cooperative subjects, and when I asked what that meant, he said the aggressive ones and the ones that tried to escape. At the bottom, the corridor was narrow and dark, and blood streaked the walls, still wet and bright. I called out for Lieutenant Caldwell and received only silence, followed by a sound that was neither animal nor human. Langley raised his weapon and suggested reinforcements, and I told him we were the reinforcements. A body lay against the wall with the name Stevens stitched to the uniform. He was already gone. Then the lights died, and when the emergency glow returned, I saw it standing at the far end of the corridor, motionless and watching. It was the same kind of being, but different in posture and intent. I ordered Langley to back away, but it crossed the distance in a blink. Langley fired, and the shots did nothing. The creature touched his forehead, and Langley collapsed like a cut marionette. I aimed, but my hands shook, and the thing tilted its head and studied me. It spoke without sound, and the words appeared in my mind telling me I should not be there. I woke later on cold concrete with pain blooming behind my eyes and Langley breathing beside me. We were in a bare cell and hours were missing from my memory. When Langley woke, he told me it had been inside his head reading him. The door opened and Captain Gregory Sinclair stood there with guards and a smile that carried no warmth. He said someone wanted to meet me. We moved deeper through corridors that grew colder and changed from metal to something organic that pulsed faintly. In a vast chamber, a massive being floated in a tank connected to machines. Sinclair said it was why the facility existed. He told me it was found near Roswell decades earlier and had been studied ever since along with others of its kind. He said the smaller ones were a delegation and they came to conduct their own research on us. Before he could explain further, the alarms returned louder and the evacuation order rang out. Darkness fell, and in it I heard tearing metal and screams and many of those guttural sounds at once. From there the timeline fractures because records do not agree. I remember red light and grabbing Sinclair and asking how many were loose, and he said he did not know. Gunfire echoed and something heavy moved through the corridors. Langley said we had to reach the surface, and Sinclair said the elevators were locked under Protocol Delta. He explained the emergency eggs. It was deeper and not meant for us but for them. A creature charged and killed a guard in seconds, and we ran. In an abandoned lab, Sinclair pulled logs showing all sectors compromised and 47 subjects released of different species. A calm voice announced a facility purge in 30 minutes, meaning incineration of everything including us. Safe zones could hold only a fraction of the personnel. Chaos filled the halls as people ran. A wounded woman begged for help and was taken by something unseen. At a junction, a young scientist named Pierce warned us not to go further and said the juveniles had been released without codes because the locks recognized them. The facility shook and bodies lay peaceful and untouched because some of the subjects could stop a heart without contact. We descended past levels stacked with dead and walls marked with symbols until we reached their section where architecture was no longer human. Survivors huddled there saying they had been herded and spared. The purge countdown continued and the bunkers were sealed. Sinclair revealed an original exit far below on level 20. Soldiers joined us and argued but followed. Deeper still, the corridors widened and living walls surrounded us. Creatures blocked our path and weapons rose until Sinclair stepped forward and spoke in their language. One addressed me mind to mind and allowed us passage, warning that something worse than the purge was coming. We ran as the structure failed and reached a massive door that opened to a natural tunnel. We fled through rock as the earth shook, and at the end light waited guarded by 3 of them. Sinclair spoke again, and they let us pass, telling us this had been a liberation and that they too were prisoners. We emerged into the desert as explosions sealed the tunnel. Fire rose from the ground, marking the buried facility. Helicopters came and we were separated and silenced. Years passed and people vanished or died and records were erased. I carried it alone until age took me, and even then the voice sometimes returned telling me I should not have been there. What followed after that first descent settled into my bones slowly like radiation that does not burn at once, but rewrites you cell by cell, and I understood even then that whatever had begun beneath the desert was no longer confined to steel corridors and sealed levels, but had followed us upward, into every breath we would take for the rest of our lives. After the explosions sealed the tunnels and the fire geysers carved scars into the New Mexico ground, we were herded apart with clinical precision. Orders came quietly through headsets and men with unreadable faces guided us to separate extraction points under the rising sun. I remember the smell of burned earth and ozone, and the way the morning light felt obscene after what we had seen. Helicopter blades chopped the air, and the noise felt distant as if I were underwater. No one spoke during the flight. We stared at hands, boots, bloodstains, anything but each other, because looking at another survivor meant acknowledging that it had all been real. Within hours, I was sitting alone in a windowless room with walls painted a neutral color designed to erase emotion. Men in suits entered one by one, never giving names, never explaining jurisdiction. They asked the same questions again and again about Sector D, about the creature in the corridor, about the voice in my head. Each time, I answered the same way, using the same words, because deviation meant danger. I could feel them watching for cracks, for doubt, for madness. Somewhere between the 8th and 9th repetition, I realized the interrogation was not about facts, but about measuring how much of me was still intact. Langley was taken elsewhere, and I never saw him during those days. I wondered if he was alive until a suited man casually mentioned that the Major was cooperating well, which told me more than reassurance ever could. Sleep came only in fragments, and when it did, the dreams were filled with long corridors and eyes that reflected my own thoughts back at me. On the 3rd day, they placed documents in front of me thick with language about national security and permanent silence. I asked what would happen if I refused, and the answer came without threat or anger. They said accidents happen and families are compensated. I signed because I understood that bravery had no place there. Within a week, my transfer orders arrived, sending me as far from New Mexico as possible. Alaska was chosen for its distance and its isolation, and perhaps because the cold mirrored the interior of my mind. The flight north felt longer than any deployment I had known. When I arrived, the base commander welcomed me with respect and curiosity, unaware that he was shaking hands with a man already buried. My duties resumed on paper, but inside I was still underground, listening for metal tearing. Langley wrote once from Germany a letter that said nothing and everything. He mentioned mountains and quiet, and that he had taken to standing outside at night. I did not reply because correspondence felt dangerous. Lieutenant Chen remained in service and rose steadily, but whenever our paths crossed at briefings or ceremonies, there was a silent understanding between us that could not be acknowledged. Pierce was reassigned to civilian research, and the announcement of his death months later arrived in a thin envelope that cited a car accident on a clear road. I stared at the paper until the words lost meaning. The soldiers who had run with us vanished from records either through retirement or funerals. 2 who refused the offered money died suddenly, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every erasure confirmed the scale of what had been protected. Years passed, and officially nothing had happened in February 1977. The facility was said to be a rumor, a fabrication, a story fed by disinformation. Yet every few years, reports surfaced of seismic activity near Dulce Lights under the desert of restricted zones expanding overnight. Each time the explanation was routine: training exercise, gas leak. Equipment failure. I collected clippings quietly and hid them away, knowing that obsession was a liability. My career advanced because I performed flawlessly, because focus is easier when distraction is eliminated by fear. I advised generals and presidents and spoke at academies about leadership and restraint and the burden of command, while never mentioning the lesson that mattered most, which was that some victories are worse than defeat. At night, the dreams persisted, and sometimes the voice returned, not accusing, but observing, reminding me that I had been seen. I wondered often about Sinclair. His records vanished entirely, as if he had never existed. Rumors placed him back in black programs or descending willingly into the depths with those he understood better than his own kind. I did not know which possibility disturbed me more. Retirement came eventually, and with it, time, which proved more dangerous than duty. In Colorado, I tried to write memoirs, but the pen stalled whenever I reached that winter. A journalist contacted me once, claiming to have documents and asking for truth. We met in a diner where the smell of grease and coffee clashed with the gravity of his questions. He spread papers across the table, reports I recognized that should not have survived. I told him I could not help, and when he pressed, I laughed, because laughter was easier than explaining that truth without context is poison. He published anyway, and the story vanished as predictably as the others. I learned of his failed attempts through quiet channels and felt a dull relief when he gave up. Silence protects not only secrets but people. When I died years later, men in suits attended without names or condolences. They stood apart and watched. My executor followed my instructions to destroy my files, but kept a photograph from 1977 with my handwriting on the back warning that some things should stay buried. Even now, recounting this, I feel the desert under my boots and the weight of a place that does not exist pressing upward from beneath the world. The pattern continues because curiosity is endless and the earth remembers. Beneath layers of explanation and denial, something waits patient and aware, and perhaps still studying us, deciding whether we are ready or whether we ever will be. After retirement, the silence grew heavier than any battlefield noise I had ever endured, because without orders or briefings, the mind begins to wander, and mine always wandered downward back through layers of stone and memory toward that place beneath the desert. Days were quiet and respectable and filled with routine errands and polite conversations with neighbors who knew me only as a retired officer with medals in a drawer. They saw stability and calm and discipline, and none of them suspected that every vibration beneath their feet made my heart pause. At night I listened to the earth, wind against the house, distant thunder, trains miles away. Every sound carried the echo of metal screaming and organic walls breathing. Sleep became something to endure rather than welcome. The dreams sharpened with age instead of fading. I walked the corridors again alone, this time without Langley or Sinclair or anyone to witness what I saw. Doors opened without codes, lights failed, eyes watched from behind glass. When I woke, the sheets were damp with sweat and my hands shook as if I had just fired a weapon. I began to notice patterns in the news that others dismissed. Small articles buried deep. Earth tremors near Dulce. Restricted airspace declared overnight. Utility workers relocated without explanation. Each report matched others years apart like a pulse. I clipped them and filed them carefully, telling myself it was academic curiosity, but knowing better. My wife asked once why I followed those stories, and I told her old habits die hard. She accepted that answer because marriage teaches people which questions not to press. I attended funerals of old colleagues and listened to conversations fade whenever I approached. Some of them knew something had happened even if they did not know what. Fear recognizes fear. I thought often of Lieutenant Chen and wondered if she still kept her journal and if she still believed that recording truth mattered. When news came of her death years later, I felt a hollow opening inside my chest that did not close. 2 weeks after the funeral, I heard through unofficial channels that her safe deposit box had been emptied without record. No investigation followed. That silence spoke louder than any confession. Langley remained alive longer than most. I visited him once at his ranch in Montana under the pretense of an old friend stopping by. We sat on his porch watching the sky darken, and he said little. At one point he asked me if I ever felt like the ground was listening. I told him yes. We did not discuss the past directly, but it stood between us like a third presence. When I left, he did not walk me to the car. He remained staring upward as if measuring distance. Years later, when word came that he had died quietly, I imagined him finally sleeping without dreams. Sinclair never resurfaced. Every attempt to trace him led to blank pages and missing references. Some nights I imagined him still walking those deeper levels, speaking in that impossible language, negotiating with beings who understood him better than his own command ever had. Other nights I imagined he had crossed fully into their world and left ours behind without regret. Both possibilities haunted me because they suggested choice. In my later years, a young historian contacted me asking about unexplained facilities operated by the Department of Energy. He was polite and cautious and framed his questions academically. I deflected and advised him to focus on declassified material. Months later, his project was canceled due to funding issues. Coincidence is a word used by people who have never seen patterns enforced. I grew careful about what I said and to whom, because even retirement does not erase surveillance. The government does not forget those who know too much. Sometimes while driving through the mountains, I felt a pressure behind my eyes and a sudden intrusion of thought not my own. It was never a voice exactly, but an impression, a sense of being checked, observed, not hostile but thorough. Each time it happened, my heart raced and then calmed as if reassured. I never told anyone because there are things that cannot be proven and should not be tested. On anniversaries of that February, I walked alone and stood on bare ground, feeling the cold seep upward, and wondered if the facility still existed sealed and dormant, or if it had been reclaimed by those who had lived there long before we drilled and labeled and claimed ownership. I questioned whether the purge had truly destroyed everything or simply erased our access. Knowledge once gained cannot be fully undone. It only changes hands. In quiet moments, I replayed the final exchange in the tunnel when Sinclair translated their meaning. Liberation, hostages, cooperation enforced by captivity. The implication reshaped everything we believed about dominance and progress. We had not been pioneers, we had been intruders. That realization cut deeper than fear because it stripped away justification. I sometimes imagine the world beneath us vast and layered with civilizations that learned to hide rather than conquer because survival favors patience. If that was true, then our curiosity had been noticed long before 1977. We had simply crossed a threshold. In my final years, a journalist I had met long ago resurfaced briefly online using a different name. He hinted again at documents and underground installations. Within days, his account disappeared. I did not reach out. Intervention would only draw attention. Silence had become my final duty. When illness came, it was quiet and expected. I prepared my affairs carefully, leaving instructions that were followed to the letter. On my last night, I lay awake listening to the house settle and felt again that sense of being observed, not from above but from below. It was not threatening, it was patient. I closed my eyes and accepted that some stories do not end. They simply sink deeper, waiting for another generation to dig too far and ask the wrong questions. Long before my own silence became policy enforced by paper and threat, the story of that place had already begun leaking into the margins of intelligence circles and civilian rumor, not as a single narrative, but as fragments that refused to align cleanly. Documents circulated without origin, testimony surfaced without witnesses, and every piece contradicted the next just enough to ensure dismissal. I later understood this was not an accident but a method. When truth is wrapped in distortion, it becomes radioactive, and no one wants to touch it. Years before my death, analysts argued quietly about whether the absence of official acknowledgement constituted proof or denial, and whether silence itself could be evidence. I had heard those debates in secure rooms where people spoke carefully and always in hypotheticals. Dulce was never named directly. It was referred to as a facility, a site, an installation, a theoretical construct. Even among professionals, there was fear attached to specificity. Names were changed, locations shifted, dates blurred, but the order of events remained stubbornly consistent across accounts. That consistency was the most dangerous element because it suggested a shared source. In 1979, a businessman from New Mexico named Paul Bennewitz began reporting strange signals emanating from deep underground near Dulce. He believed they were non-human communications, and he documented them obsessively. At first, he was dismissed as eccentric, then quietly monitored. Agents visited him not to arrest, but to advise, to redirect, to confuse. Disinformation was introduced, deliberately mixing genuine fragments with fabricated details until his understanding collapsed under its own weight. Within 2 years, he suffered a complete psychological breakdown and was institutionalized. Officially, it was mental illness. Unofficially, it was a containment success. His story became a cautionary tale inside agencies about curiosity without clearance. Former intelligence officers later admitted that disinformation is most effective when it carries a core of truth, because that truth anchors belief while the surrounding falsehood discredits the whole. Victor Marchetti once said the purpose is not to hide programs, but to make them impossible to understand. Dulce became the perfect example. Every time someone approached it seriously, they were drowned in noise. Meanwhile, the Department of Energy continued operating hundreds of classified facilities across the country, with budgets hidden in black lines and locations omitted entirely. One more would never be noticed. Satellite imagery from the late 1977 period showed unusual heat signatures in northern New Mexico, consistent with underground detonations. When questioned, officials labeled it routine testing. Those of us who understood thermal output knew that explanation was absurd, but absurdity is often more effective than denial because it invites ridicule. No hearings followed, no inquiries were opened. Careers remained intact. That absence of response required power at a level beyond any individual. It required agreement. Over time, the men who had been present began disappearing, not dramatically, but quietly. Records altered, then erased again until the erasure itself vanished. Captain Sinclair became a ghost in every sense. Even his deletion was deleted. It was as if acknowledging his absence would create a trail. Rumors persisted that he had returned to deep programs or that he had crossed into the subterranean world permanently. Neither could be confirmed, and that uncertainty was itself a form of containment. Lieutenant Chen left behind an encrypted journal discovered by her daughter years later. The daughter believed it was fiction until the journal vanished from a secure vault without trace. No suspects. No investigation. The pattern repeated so often it became invisible. I often wondered whether the beings beneath the earth observed these manipulations with curiosity or amusement. They understood secrecy far better than we did. They had survived by remaining unseen, while we survived by controlling narrative. Those strategies eventually collided. In my final years, I re-examined everything we had been told about the Roswell incident and realized how shallow the official story was. The craft recovered in 1947 had not arrived from above but from below. It had been damaged emerging, not descending. That single inversion reframed decades of speculation. If those beings had lived beneath us for millennia, then our technological progress would have appeared not impressive but threatening because it pointed downward. Drilling, mining, tunneling, nuclear testing, all of it breached layers that had never been meant for us. The facility we called Research Station 7 had not been entirely built. We had founded, expanded it, and convinced ourselves ownership followed discovery. The organic architecture I saw on lower levels was not experimental. It was original. We were the guests and later the jailers. The purge that destroyed the complex was not simply to erase evidence. It was to reset a boundary. When the journalist I met asked if people deserved the truth, I understood his moral urgency, but morality without survival is indulgence. Truth without context invites panic, and panic invites violence. Perhaps the deeper intelligence had calculated that humanity was not ready, not because of weakness, but because of arrogance. Every civilization reaches a point where curiosity outruns restraint. We reached ours beneath the desert. When I hear people ask today whether Dulce Base is real, I remember the men in suits at my funeral and the photograph with my handwriting warning that some things should stay buried. Reality does not require belief. It requires only persistence. Beneath the earth, beneath the desert, beneath every official denial, something remains patient and observant, waiting for us to decide whether we will learn or repeat. As the years folded inward and memory became both sharper and more treacherous, I began to understand that what haunted me most was not the violence or the secrecy or even the deaths, but the implication that our species had been observed and judged long before we believed ourselves capable of judgment. Everything we had uncovered beneath the desert pointed to a presence that did not fear us but evaluated us the way a biologist studies an aggressive specimen, deciding whether it can be released or must remain contained. That realization reframed every moment I had lived through in that facility. The holding cells were not prisons in the way we understood them. They were leverage. The research was not curiosity. It was negotiation enforced by captivity. We believed we were studying them, while in truth they were studying our reactions to power and dominance and fear. When containment failed and the subjects were released, the pattern of deaths revealed intent. Some were torn apart quickly because they resisted violently. Others were found intact and peaceful because they posed no threat. That was not chaos, that was discrimination. When the survivors were herded into lower levels and spared, it was not mercy. It was preservation. They needed witnesses. They needed us alive long enough to understand what had happened and to carry that understanding back to the surface. The purge that followed was not an act of rage. It was sanitation. a way to erase contamination introduced by prolonged proximity between two civilizations that should never have intersected so directly. I realized later that Protocol Delta had not been designed by human minds alone. Its logic was too absolute, too final, too willing to sacrifice hundreds to preserve a boundary. Human bureaucracy hesitates, it negotiates, it delays. Protocol Delta did none of those things, it executed. That suggested collaboration at a level we never acknowledged publicly. When Sinclair spoke their language, it was not because he had been trained. It was because he had been taught. He had crossed a line quietly and irrevocably, and once crossed, there was no returning to simple allegiance. That may be why his records vanished so completely. He represented proof that cooperation was possible, and that proof was more dangerous than denial. After the incident, every policy discussion I sat through about underground construction or deep drilling carried an unspoken tension. Proposals were quietly altered or shelved. Funding was redirected. Entire projects disappeared without explanation. On the surface, these were budgetary decisions. Beneath them lay restraint enforced by fear. Not fear of attack, but fear of consequence. Those beneath the earth had demonstrated capability without escalation. They could destroy us if they chose. They did not. That restraint was the most unsettling aspect. It suggested confidence. Over time, I noticed a shift in how unexplained phenomena were handled. Instead of outright denial, there was amplification. Every rumor was exaggerated, every story sensationalized until credibility collapsed. Public drowned in speculation about aliens from the stars, while the truth beneath their feet remained undisturbed. Space became the distraction. Underground became the taboo. That strategy worked because it aligned with human imagination, which always looks upward for gods and monsters, never inward. When seismic activity occurred near Dulce years later, the response was immediate and heavy. Military cordons scientific teams' non-disclosure agreements. Official explanations never matched observed logistics. Each time I felt a tightening in my chest because the pattern was repeating. Someone had drilled too deep again. Someone had ignored the quiet warnings encoded in decades of suppression. I wondered if those beneath the earth felt frustration or simply patience. Time favors those who can wait. Humans rarely can. I sometimes considered what would happen if the boundary failed again on a larger scale. Not an isolated facility, but a network of breaches. Would they retreat deeper, or would restraint end? The answer depended on whether they believed we were capable of learning. Evidence suggested mixed results. We learned to hide, we learned to lie, we learned to forget. But did we learn restraint? That question remained open. In my last conversations with officials still active, I sensed fatigue. Not moral fatigue, but existential fatigue. Carrying a secret that large erodes conviction. It forces compromise after compromise until purpose blurs. One man admitted quietly that he no longer knew who the containment was for. Us or them. That ambiguity marked the true failure of the project. When you cannot identify the threat, you become it. In quiet moments, I imagined the subterranean world vast and layered with rememberers who tracked our progress the way astronomers track comets, waiting to see if trajectories change. We had been given a warning not through words, but through demonstration. They showed us what they could do and then allowed us to leave. That choice carried expectation. Decades later, the expectation remained unmet. We continued drilling, continued testing, continued expanding without asking who else lived beneath our ambitions. As I write this knowing it will never be read publicly, I feel the same weight I felt in that corridor when the voice entered my mind. You should not be here. It was not anger, it was assessment, and the assessment continues. In the final decade of my life, the world above ground accelerated while the world beneath it remained patient and unchanged, and that contrast became impossible to ignore once I no longer had the distractions of command or duty. Technology advanced faster than restraint, and every new capability seemed designed to push deeper, drill further, and map what had never been meant to be mapped. Publicly, this was framed as progress and energy, independence and scientific necessity. Privately, it was driven by fear that someone else might reach those depths first. The same logic that had led to the creation of Research Station 7 continued to operate long after its destruction. I watched younger officers brief confidently about subterranean sensors and deep Earth imaging without understanding that some voids are empty by design. Each time I heard such language, I remembered the organic walls pulsing softly like living skin and understood that mapping is not the same as knowing. I was invited once to consult on a classified assessment regarding unexplained seismic anomalies. The data was clean and precise and terrifying in its implications. Movement patterns did not align with tectonic behavior. They suggested intent. When I pointed this out, the room fell quiet and the subject was changed. That was when I realized that awareness had not disappeared. It had simply retreated into silence. We knew, we chose not to acknowledge. That choice defined our relationship with whatever lay beneath us. Fear had evolved into denial and denial into habit. Meanwhile, stories continued to surface through unofficial channels. Miners reporting sounds like distant machinery far below expected depths. Tunnel workers claiming walls felt warm and responsive. Geologists resigning abruptly after field surveys. Each incident was isolated, explained away, compensated, and buried. The method was consistent because it worked. People believe what allows them to sleep. I began to receive letters from strangers who somehow knew to find me. Some claimed relatives had vanished near restricted zones. Others described dreams of descending stairwells and waking with nosebleeds and headaches. I did not reply. Engaging would have placed them in danger. Silence again became the only protection I could offer. At times I questioned whether my restraint was cowardice disguised as wisdom. That doubt followed me relentlessly. I wondered if speaking openly might force accountability or whether it would simply trigger another purge. The truth is that openness requires a system capable of absorbing shock. Ours was not. It still is not. When officials talk about readiness, they refer to weapons and logistics and supply chains. They never consider psychological readiness. Humanity struggles to accept difference even among itself. The revelation that another intelligence shares this planet and predates us would fracture societies overnight. Those beneath the earth understood this long before we did. Their restraint was not mercy. It was strategy. They allowed us to leave because destruction would have been inefficient. Containment was easier. Let us police ourselves. Let us erase our own witnesses. That way responsibility remained ours. I often thought about the juveniles Pierce mentioned and the way locks opened at their touch. That detail haunted me because it suggested the facility itself had begun to recognize them as rightful occupants. Architecture responding to biology, systems choosing allegiance, that transition marked the moment we lost control completely, even if we pretended otherwise. Control is an illusion maintained through repetition. Once broken, it cannot be restored by force alone. It requires legitimacy. We never had it. In my final years, I experienced moments of clarity that felt imposed rather than generated. Sudden understanding without process. Answers appearing without question. They were brief and faded quickly, but they left an aftertaste of certainty. During those moments, I sensed not intrusion, but communication stripped of language, a reminder perhaps, or a check. I could never be sure. I stopped fearing these moments because fear implies vulnerability, and whatever watched me no longer considered me a variable. I was an observation complete. Sometimes I wondered if my long life had been intentional. Others died young through accidents or heart failure or erasure. I lived into my 90s with a clear mind and steady health until the end. Perhaps I had been preserved as a record, a control sample. The thought was unsettling but consistent with everything else. When death approached, it did so quietly without pain. In those final nights, I dreamed not of corridors or alarms, but of vast spaces beneath the earth, illuminated by soft bioluminescence and structured with calm purpose. I sensed community rather than menace, order rather than chaos, the opposite of what we had brought with us. If those dreams were projections or memories or messages, I cannot say, but they replaced fear with something closer to resignation. Humanity likes to believe it sits at the center of all narratives. The truth is more complex and far less flattering. We are participants, not authors. We are observed, not alone. And the greatest danger we pose is not aggression, but ignorance amplified by confidence. As my breathing slowed for the last time, I understood that the question was never whether Dulce Base existed. It was whether we deserved to know it did. What remains at the end of this account is not closure, because closure implies resolution, and nothing about what happened beneath the desert ever resolved itself in a way the human mind prefers. Instead, there is only continuity, a line drawn forward from that winter night in February 1977. Through every quiet suppression, every vanished file, every denied inquiry, and every tremor that ripples beneath the soil even now. After my death, the men in suits did exactly what they were meant to do. They observed, they confirmed silence, and they moved on. My personal effects were cataloged and destroyed according to instruction, with one exception, because systems always allow for human error, and that error is sometimes the only reason stories survive. The photograph from that year passed hands quietly, and the words on its back lingered without context. Some things should stay buried. That sentence was not a warning to the public. It was a reminder to those who already knew. In the years since my passing, the world has grown louder and more distracted and more certain of its own centrality. Satellites multiply, drills go deeper, data flows faster. Yet the desert near Dulce remains strangely guarded, not by fences alone but by absence. Roads reroute, projects stall, survey teams rotate out quickly. Locals learn which questions not to ask, and children grow up accepting restricted skies as normal. That is how normalization works. It does not announce itself. It settles in. From time to time, someone stumbles onto fragments of the truth through leaked documents or archived testimony and assembles a narrative that almost fits. Almost. Those stories circulate briefly, then collapse under their own weight, because the missing pieces matter more than the present ones. The order of events is preserved even when names and places change, and that is what frightens those tasked with containment. Order implies design, design implies intent, intent implies responsibility. If there is one lesson that survives everything else, it is this: the greatest protection of that secret was never force or threat or even death. It was fragmentation. No one person ever held the whole picture. Each of us carried a shard, and those shards were scattered deliberately. Even I carried only what I saw, and what I inferred, and what I was allowed to remember. There were deeper levels than I reached, and older agreements than I was briefed on, and contingencies I never learned. That ignorance was not failure, it was architecture. People often ask whether the beings beneath the earth were hostile. That question reveals more about us than them. Hostility requires intent to dominate. What I witnessed was restraint backed by overwhelming capability. They did not conquer us because conquest was unnecessary. We exposed ourselves through our behavior, through our willingness to imprison what we did not understand and exploit what we could not control. The facility did not fall because of an external attack. It collapsed because the boundary between observer and captive inverted. The moment the systems began responding to them, rather than us, the outcome was decided. Everything after that was cleanup. When the purge sealed the tunnels and fire consumed the underground structure, it was not erasing them. It was erasing our footprint. They did not need the facility, we did. That distinction matters. In the decades since, there has been no retaliation, no invasion, no open contact. That absence is often cited as proof that nothing ever existed. The opposite is true. The absence is proof of success. Containment does not require confrontation when separation is sufficient. We were allowed to leave because we were no longer a threat in that context. Whether we become one again depends entirely on our choices. The signals reported by civilians, the dreams, the unexplained illnesses, the sudden clarity followed by confusion, these are not attacks. They are side effects of proximity and curiosity. Touching a boundary leaves residue. People sense it without understanding. That is why the stories persist even as evidence vanishes. Memory is harder to suppress than paper. Toward the end of my life, I accepted that my role was not to reveal or to warn, but to endure and to observe. Survival sometimes requires silence more than speech. That is a difficult truth for any soldier to accept because we are trained to act. Yet restraint was the lesson imposed on us beneath the earth. Act and you are erased. Observe and you may persist. Humanity has not learned that lesson fully. We continue to confuse capability with entitlement and curiosity with right. Perhaps one day that will change. Perhaps another breach will force the issue and the restraint shown to us will not be repeated. Or perhaps patience will continue to outlast us as it has before. I do not know. What I know is this. According to every official record, nothing happened at Dulce. The base never existed. The men involved either died or retired quietly. The documents were destroyed, the questions were buried, and yet the pattern continues because truth does not require permission. It only requires time. Beneath the desert, beneath the earth, beneath every certainty, we cling to something remains awake and aware, and waiting not for invasion or revelation, but for understanding. Until then, the silence holds and the story remains unfinished. If this account stayed with you, then it did what it was meant to do. Some stories are not told to give comfort, but to leave a mark and a question that follows you after the words end. If you want more first-person military horror and hidden history told without filters, then support this work. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who understands that silence is sometimes louder than truth. Stay aware and stay curious because some doors are closed for a reason.